You're listening to the second segment of our four-part series, Using Your Weeds, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome to Time Monk Radio.
Green blessings, Gemini. I'm so excited to be back here with you. Thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you here, and we're going to continue our discussion on weeds. We touched on several things last week, purslane and other various things that are nutritious for us, so would love to hear more.
Good. I'm so glad you remembered purslane. That's wonderful. As I said last week, the weeds in our gardens do a huge amount for us, and I often ask people to consider whether or not they are participating in warfare gardening. And often when I say that, people kind of look at me and say, do you mean am I spraying Agent Orange on my garden? I say, well, we could start there, but it also gets, softer, shall we say. Perhaps you're merely spraying Roundup in your garden. And that's certainly chemical warfare. And it's even called an herbicide, right? It's called an herb killer. But even if you're organic and you would never dream of spraying that kind of herbicide in your garden, perhaps you do take a hoe and chop their little heads off. And that also is really making war against those plants. Or maybe you're the kind of, sit in your garden and dreamily pull those damn weeds. I should say, pull those darn weeds out. Yes, indeed. Which is still, in its own way, making war on the plants. When we work in our gardens here at the Wise Woman Center, I ask the apprentices to really value the life of each and every plant that they are working with. And that if it's a plant that they're harvesting for our use, to be very conscious of that, be conscious of that life force emanation from that plant. And if it's a plant that's being harvested to make room for plants that we want to eat, and then we're going to feed what we've just harvested to the rabbits, that still we want to feel that flow of life force energy, that flow of chi, that mysterious movement that moves through us all. And that is a sacred act to garden, to remove plants, just as it is a sacred act to eat my rabbits. It is all the wheel of life and death. So I'm not saying to have a non-warfare garden, that you have to let everything be exactly as it would be if it was growing wild. I mean, what is the essence of being a gardener if it's not to manipulate the plants and to have one place in nature that's under control? Yes, it's the way I want it, and it's growing what I want to see and what I want to eat and what I want to have. But what I'm suggesting is that we could partnership a little bit more with what grows amidst our basil and our dill, unbidden. What kinds of weeds would we find in the ordinary garden? I often like to bring out a really beautiful book that I have, and it's called Australian Weeds, a Source of Food and Medicine. And people, of course, think of Australia as being very distant, and certainly it is. But we think that that distance means that the plants are different, and certainly the native plants there are. But let me read you the list of weeds in this Australian Weeds book. Amaranth, blackberry, burdock, chickweed, chicory, dandelion, duck, evening primrose, fat hen. That's what they call lamb's quarter. They have a slightly different species with bigger, a little fleshier leaf, and it's called fat hen. Fennel, field mustard, ground ivy, hedge mustard, horehound inkweed, mallow, mellow, mugwort, nettle, ox-eye daisy, prickly lettuce, purslane red clover, sweet briar rose, shepherd's purse, sorrel, sow thistle, violet, watercress, white clover, wild carrot, wild celery, wood sorrel, and yarrow. And every single one of those plants is indeed available to you, listener, most likely wherever you are. The weeds are the plants that travel very easily, aren't they?
Yes.
Yes, many, many. I mean, that's what makes them weeds, is that they travel around so easily. They're familiar, they're common, they're abundant, you know. They're just like everywhere around us. And in the garden especially, we turn them into our enemy. So I often say that the gardener's best revenge is to eat your weeds. So let's start with the green parts of the weeds. Now, greens, greens. I think that a really healthy diet includes well-cooked greens on virtually a daily basis. In fact, so long as you're eating well-cooked daily greens, I don't think you need to worry about eating salad if you don't much like salad. But salad doesn't replace your cooked greens. So what kind of weeds in your garden would give you greens, and how can we prepare and use these greens, and how do they taste, and what will we get from them? Well, let's go back to our list, because it's a great list of weeds, isn't it? Amaranth, right off, provides a delicious green. And the wonderful thing about amaranth is the entire plant, minus the root and minus the flowers, is edible. Now, that said, most amaranth plants have their kind of prickery flower cases in the leaf axils. We could call it kind of the armpit of the plant there. And once they start to develop, they're really hard to get out of there. So it's really important to find your amaranth when it's young and get that young amaranth before it starts to develop any flowers. Remember, this is an annual plant. It wants to just grow straight up, have flowers, lots and lots of flowers, lots and lots of seeds, and die. And what we want to do is we want to find that plant when it's just coming up. Maybe it's only 4 or 5 inches high, and we're going to snip off the top, and it's going to sprout 2 heads. Yes, okay. And those 2 heads are going to grow, and then we're going to snip them off 3 or 4 weeks later, and each one of those is going to grow too. And we're going to have a supply of young, tender amaranth until it finally gets ahead of us, like the basil, and says, I am having flowers and seeds. You can't stop me anymore. Or what I sometimes do to get amaranth is I go to my CSA. And my CSA is really thrilled to see me and the apprentices come with our huge harvesting baskets and go, we're harvesting amaranth. They're like, yes, we are so happy. Take it away. We're harvesting lamb's quarter. Yes, you can come every day and harvest here, because a big operation like a community-supported agriculture farm, often because they're organic, doesn't have time to deal as well with their weeds as they would like to. And they see us come smiling into the fields to take the weeds. They are quite thrilled. And the amaranth there, of course, is growing just like the lamb's quarter, up like a rocket. And if we go when it's young, we can just almost cut down forests of amaranth without any flowers at all to bring home. In Jamaica, the amaranth greens are called callaloo. And I had actually gone with the apprentices one week. It was just the right time to get the amaranth. And we had gone out to our CSA, and we had gotten, so much amaranth. Fortunately, it's not difficult to process. We just kind of chop it up and cook it really well, and cook it for about an hour, and then eat what we want and freeze the rest. It lasts very well in the freezer. When my sweetheart called home and said, I'm down at the apple farm here, and the Jamaicans have just given me a whole truckload of callaloo, which I'm coming home with, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was amaranth because, of course, the truck wasn't filled with it yet. When he went outside and saw they had just filled the entire bed of the pickup truck with huge amounts of amaranth that they had cut out of their garden, he had to laugh. Amaranth, like the lamb's quarter, is an extremely protein-rich green, as well as green with lavish amounts of minerals in it. As a matter of fact, one of the things that was very interesting to me about both amaranth and lamb's quarter is that they do grow in the desert southwest as well as in the misty mountains of the northeast. So these plants have great range, as we saw, all the way from well up into the Scandinavian countries and down into the heat of Australia. You're going to find these plants growing there, drought resistant as amaranth and the lamb's quarter, and they were actually an important part of the diet of the peoples of the southwest of the United States. And as they were moved from their more natural diet onto the processed foods of civilization, their rates of diabetes began to skyrocket. There are some communities in the desert southwest where 80% of the populace has type 2 diabetes. And a very brilliant person wondered what would happen if amaranth greens and lamb's quarters greens were put back into these people's diets without changing the diet. They were still eating processed foods, unfortunately. But just putting the amaranth greens and the lamb's quarter greens cooked back into the diet was enough to significantly lower the incidence of type 2 diabetes. And these plants move great energy into the body in slow and significant ways, helping our use of insulin. Blackberry, well, we're not going to eat the blackberry leaves, and bracken, which gives us fiddleheads. I don't recommend eating the bracken because when I was in New Zealand, I learned that the Maori, who are not native to New Zealand, ate a lot of fiddleheads because they knew that they were safe, and they actually ground their teeth away. And then it turns out that bracken, the most commonly eaten fiddlehead, is actually a carcinogen. Also, I spent a great amount of time, an entire year, with the ferns here where I live in the Catskill Mountains. And at the end of that time, I said to the ferns, tell me what I should teach other people about you. Should I teach them, the things I know about using you for medicine? Should I teach them the things I know about using you for food? What should I teach them? And the ferns said to me, the time for our use in these ways is past. You should not teach people at all to use us. You should tell them to leave the ferns alone. And so I carry that forward. Burdock, well, I don't usually use the burdock leaves because they're bitter, but I use the burdock petioles. That's the stalk of the burdock leaf. And many people mistake the burdock petiole for rhubarb. Now, certainly burdock has big leaves and rhubarb has big leaves, but the rhubarb leaves are kind of shiny and a lot more crinkled, and the burdock leaves are kind of dusky and quite dusky white on the underneath, and more nappy and not shiny. Although certainly the petioles, that leaf stalk, does look similar, in both of them being kind of grooved or even almost U kind of shaped, and in the rhubarb it can be very bright red, and the burdock kind of a reddish purple color. And the burdock stalks can be harvested. Those petioles can be harvested. I feed the leaves to my rabbits and thus get the good going back again and again into my garden. And then I take the stalks and under running water, I rub that white fuzz that I was just talking about off of them with my thumb. Some people prefer to cut them into pieces and boil them and then rub that white fuzz off. And it may be a little bit easier after they have been boiled, but I find it easiest to use the whole stalk and not to have to cut it into pieces. Whichever way you do it, you're going to have to rub that fuzz off, and you're going to have to boil those pieces for at least half an hour. Sometimes I boil them for an hour. At this point, they're now ready to be cooked in some ingenious and interesting way. One of the easiest ways to cook them is to dip them in egg and then in something like nutritional yeast, or some kind of flour, even rice flour. and to bake them in the oven, or if you want to, fry them in a little bit of coconut fat or even bacon grease. Just went to a recent workshop on heart health, and they were saying that organic bacon grease is one of the best things you can do for your heart. So, Burdock petioles, they are really an interesting taste. If they've gotten stringy, if you've waited until the leaves are very large and they will be stringy, then I suggest you just deal with it the way you deal with the artichoke. You know, there's part of the artichoke that isn't edible either, and you use your teeth to get out the soft stuff that is edible. Chickweed, whoo, that is some green. I really love a chickweed, and I endeavor to get as much chickweed as I possibly can growing in my gardens. I actually have two kinds of stellaria growing in my gardens, the regular chickweed, Stellaria media, and a giant chickweed, Stellaria pubera. Most of the chickweeds that you have growing around you are going to be one of those two kinds, and they are both deliciously, wonderfully edible, and very important medicines as well. You can tincture the fresh chickweed, or you can make an oil of the fresh chickweed. And if you're thinking, well, I don't have a garden, where am I going to find chickweed? You know, chickweed loves to grow in parks. Look for it in parks. Chickweed loves to grow in planters in the midst of cities. I sent my students out in Amsterdam on one cold February day to come back with plants. They had an hour, and they came back with 30 different plants, all of which were medicinal or edible. And almost every single one of them, we sent them out in little groups, came back with chickweed. They had found it in so many places, yes, right in the middle of the winter. Chickweed likes it cold. Now, if you're listening to this during the heat of the summer, you may not be able to find chickweed because it really does like it cold, but keep your eye peeled for that chickweed as the weather cools. And think about the power of chickweed medicine. Chickweed contains saponins, which are slippery. And these slippery saponins can be used in that oil to help melt away various kinds of things under the skin, and to be used as a lubricant for a variety of lubrication desires. The tincture carries the saponins into the body and helps to dissolve tumors that are not right under the skin but need to be gotten to through an internal application. Now, if you're thinking saponin, is that like soap? It is. And plants that have a lot of saponin we can't use because soap makes us nauseated. But what does soap do? Let's think about it. Soap breaks down fat molecules. It actually breaks fat molecules up into tiny little pieces so that they can be dealt with. So you don't have a big glob of fat, and you have tiny, tiny, tiny little bits of fat. And the saponins in chickweed do the same thing in our bodies. So they have a variety of powerful effects in the body, from helping us to lose weight or maintain good weight by helping to emulsify our fat, to helping our liver, keeping our liver strong so that the liver doesn't have to make so much bile, because the bile also emulsifies the fat, so the chickweed can do that for us, to helping with hormonal issues, and especially to hormonally induce cysts, like cysts in the ovaries and cysts in the breast, which are generally fairly easy to melt away with chickweed tincture. A weed in the garden, a weed in the city, and that is a powerhouse of nutrition. Eat as much chickweed as I can in my salads. I make chickweed pesto. I don't bother to cook the chickweed because the chickweed is kind of stringy, and if you cook it, it's just kind of wilted strings. Don't bother. Chop it up, put it in your salads, chop it very, very, very finely, and make a pesto with your chickweed. You will come to adore chickweed. It's one of the plants that I hope you start to yearn for after spending time with a Susun weed here at Time Monk Radio, talking about weeds. Chicory is a beautiful flower, and we'll talk about that under flowers, but I don't eat the chicory leaves, although some people do. I prefer the dandelion leaves. Now, dandelion, I often say, is one of the most generous plants that we have, as its root, its leaves, its stalks, and its flowers are all usable. About the only category that we're going to be talking about where dandelion is not used as seeds, and I guess that's because it's kind of hard to catch those seeds as they're flying around. That herbalists don't use dandelion seeds, because I bet if we could, we would. We love dandelion, but let's talk about dandelion greens. In my book, Wise Woman Herbal for the Childbearing Year, I have a great recipe for Dandelion Italiano. And dandelion is one of those plants that Joseph Coconero was thinking about, is this a cultivated plant or is this a wild plant? Now, one of the kind of ways that we distinguish between something that's really been domesticated and something that's still, kind of just hanging out with us is what would happen if we didn't cultivate it. So it's pretty interesting. People often say to me, is there any natural way to get rid of the dandelion in my lawn? I mean, it's not that I don't like dandelion, but I look out there and my lawn is just solid yellow, and I'd like to have less dandelion, please. And I, of course, try to talk them into making, dandelion flower wine, because it's awfully good. But I say, really, you want to get rid of your dandelion? It's very, very simple, and it's very, very natural. Do not mow your lawn. Don't mow your lawn at all, because dandelion needs the sun and it can't compete with grass. And so if you let your grass grow for an entire year, you won't have any dandelion. So now I bet that surprised you, huh? That you thought, oh yeah, dandelion, that's a really, really big weed. And it is a weed, but it's a weed that in fact we're actually kind of cultivating, because we are creating the ideal conditions for that plant. I once took the apprentices to work for, myself and the apprentices, worked with a friend of mine who had some very strange ideas. And this is one of the reasons I loved working in her garden, because her ideas were so different than my ideas. I got really fresh new experiences. So one week she had the apprentices dig up every dandelion they could find in her garden, and we were allowed to bring them home. And we tinctured the roots, and we made pesto out of the leaves, and we just totally enjoyed those dandelions. And then we could hardly keep from rolling on the ground laughing the next week when she handed the apprentices a package of dandelion seeds and asked them to plant a row of dandelion in her garden. I did actually ask her. I said, this strikes me as rather odd that you had all the dandelions dug up, and then a week later you planted dandelions. She said, well, yes, I didn't want the wild ones to interbreed with the ones that I was planting. And, of course, they are exactly the same plant. So I don't think that anything particularly bad would have happened had she left the other dandelions there. Dandelion greens are one of the great bitters of the world. Check out Dandelion Italiano in Wise Woman Herbal for the Childbearing Year. It's a delicious dish, and you can use it with greens, dandelion greens that you buy at the supermarket. I rinse them, chop them, and pour boiling water over them. Bring them to a boil, pour the boiling water off. Pour more boiling water, bring them up to a boil for the second time, and pour the second boiling water off. Pour more boiling water over my dandelion greens, and then let them cook for about half an hour and drain them. Put them in some kind of flat-bottomed dish and add olive oil and tamari and chopped raw garlic. You have a dish fit for royalty, absolutely. Well, we haven't gotten terribly far in our list, have we? We're only down to the D's. Look at all these plants that provide greens for us dock. Many of the docks can't be eaten, but yellow dock leaves are yummy. Check out my website, SusanWeed.com, and you'll find a pucker-up salad using yellow dock leaves. Fat hen, that's lamb's quarter. We talked about that. That is delicious. Both as a cooked green and as a salad green. Fennel, of course, we can use the greens of that. And fennel, the wild fennel usually does not have a big enough root to cook, but certainly the cultivated fennel does, and they are, again, the exact same plant. But the field mustard and the hedge mustard, I love the greens of, and I mostly use them in salads, but that's partly because there just isn't enough around me to bother cooking. Ground ivy, another delicious green and a powerhouse of medicine. was at the International Herb Symposium and told by some people there that ground ivy has been shown to have very strong antiviral qualities as well as antibacterial qualities, and that many herbalists have been kind of overlooking this extremely common plant as a superb source of some of the medicines that we need most right now. I love ground ivy in my salads. I usually call it creeping Jenny. And I just love its cheery kind of blue purple flowers that just seem to be there forever. The exuberance of this plant, it just climbs over things and it spreads its wings and it roots everywhere and it flowers and it flowers and it flowers and it flowers and it flowers. And, you know, people say ground ivy, I have other names for that plant because it can, it's true, get a little obnoxious in the garden where it forms dense mats, providing an absolute barrier to the sprouting of other seeds. So aren't you glad to know that you can harvest that ground ivy? You don't have to make war on it, even if you are, oh, money padme hum, pulling it out by the roots and making way for that tomato plant or that cabbage plant or whatever it is that you want to plant there, and that you can put that ground ivy in your salad. You can make a tincture of that ground ivy and use it as a way to deal with viral and bacterial infections, but don't bother giving it to your rabbits because rabbits don't like minty things. The mallows, oh mallows, the mallows are so sweet and so tender, and we put them in our salads, and we love them so much. Melalote, melalotus means honey flower, mela, honey lotus flower, melalotus. All along the roadsides right about now, you will see a tallish plant, 4 or 5 feet high, sometimes taller, with yellow flowers or white flowers, big panicles of them, up top in the plant, waving as the car goes by. That's melalotus. It's a kind of clover. If you stop and look closely, you'll see those 3 leaves. It's 1, 2, 3, not just a pair, but 3 leaves. And we'll get back to melalotus when we talk about flowers. I generally don't eat the leaves of the clovers, and I actually generally don't give them to my rabbits either. Mugwort, which I call coronewort, Artemisia vulgaris, is wonderful in salads when it's young. As it gets a bit older, it makes a fabulous vinegar that we can put on our salads, a very, very mineral-rich vinegar, and also one that's a tonic to the urinary tract, a tonic to the heart, and a tonic to the nervous system. As the coronewort said to me, everything an old woman needs. If we let that coronewort get even taller, it is then harvested and produces one of the great healing remedies and healing techniques of the world. And that taller but not yet flowering Artemisia vulgaris, or Artemisia chinensis, is harvested and turned into moxa. And the technique of moxibustion, burning moxa over acupuncture points, is a very well-established way to tonify the body and to do a really amazing job of healing. And all of that comes from this very, very common weed, Artemisia vulgaris. Nasturtium. When I first read nasturtium, I thought, oh, come on. But then I went to California and I saw what nasturtium can do if left to itself. Again, this is not really a cultivated plant. Let it get into its habitat, and it just takes over. It doesn't really need us at all. And nasturtium leaves are delicious in salad, as are the flowers. Nettle, oh, be still my heart. Nettle. We make soup from the very beginning of the year to the very end of the year. Nettle is a powerhouse of nutrition. It is about 10% protein. It provides all the minerals, all the vitamins, all the everything that we need. As a matter of fact, I make a nourishing herbal infusion from nettle. I harvest my nettle before the flower buds are even present and dry it. And then I take the nettle leaf and the stalk and I cut it up fairly fine. I weigh out 1 ounce of it and put that in a quart jar. And I fill that jar right up to the top of the boiling water. Put a tight lid on it and let it sit overnight. Then in the morning, I strain it out. The liquid's very dark. and squeeze the dried, wet nettle leaves to get all the stuff out of them. And then, of course, put that spent herb into my compost and refrigerate the strained liquid, the infusion. Put it in my refrigerator and drink it over the next day or two. Jim and I have been talking about nourishing herbal infusions for a while now. Have you given them a try at all?
I actually have. There are about four, like oat straw was one that we did, and nettle, I thought was the other one. I'd have to go look in my pantry, but yes, I
Yeah.
took your wonderful advice and my husband and I both do them.
And do you find the nourishment and energy in nettle extraordinary?
Yes, we can tell a difference when we don't take it as well.
Absolutely. And, I use this as my primary drink. As a matter of fact, I don't drink water, and I don't allow the apprentices to drink water until they've drunk an entire quart of infusion in a day.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, so they must
Why bother?
have a lot of energy.
Yes, why bother with water? There's no real vitamins in it. There's no real minerals in it. And if you pay, to buy water that has had vitamins and minerals added, those are not the natural vitamins and minerals. For less than you pay for that bottle of fancy water, you can make yourself a quart of nettle infusion and get huge amount of electrolytes and everything else that you need. So yay, hooray for nettle.
Yes, my husband loves the oat straw as well.
And oat straw often grows as a weed in gardens. It's another weed whose greens we use. Well, we have come once again to the end of a show. Oh my goodness. Come and visit me at www.susanweed.com or check out my books. Wise Woman Herbal for the Childbearing Year, my big green book, Healing Wise, New Menopausal Years, The Wise Woman Way, or my big blue book for everybody down there, Sexual and Reproductive Health, or Breast Cancer, breast health, exclamation point, The Wise Woman Way. You can find those at the Wise Woman Bookshop. And you will also find there information about my correspondence courses as well as my at-home courses. You can come if you live nearby. And my tour, I'm out and about going to conferences and teaching all over the place. Come and join with me for lots more green blessings. Thank you, Gemini.
Thank you, Susan. This was fun again. This completes the second segment of our four-part series, Using Your Weeds with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.